Welcome back to My Creative Classroom for another special episode about the upcoming Atlantic Education Institute being held virtually from July 26th to August 6th. You can visit connected-community.ca for more details. And whether you're listening to us on your preferred streaming platform or watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe and share. Now, welcome back, because I am excited about this episode because I'm honored to welcome the opening keynote speaker from the Atlantic Education Institute. He supports shaping organizations and systems at the structure and leadership level to achieve innovation and excellence. He is the author of Constructing Leadership 4.0. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Richard Kelly. Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Brian.
So, Dr. Kelly, let's tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what brought you to kind of publishing literature about leadership.
Wow. I spent 30 years in organizations, and I've gone through certain cycles, because I started out thinking I was developing leaders. And then I thought I was maybe developing organizations, because my background is organizational development. And then I kind of realized pretty late in the game that in fact what I'm doing is developing systems. I'm developing, in fact, the systems for leaders and organizations and projects to work. And for me, that was a way in to thinking about how can I put that into some learning for myself, my journey, and how can I communicate that journey maybe to a readership. So I went through an odyssey, and my book is really my own personal odyssey around how I have come to think differently about organizations and leadership. Yeah.
That's an amazing story. And you mentioned the book. So let's talk a little bit about Constructing Leadership 4.0 for our listeners and our viewers who may not quite know of that book. What can people expect when they pick it off the shelf and start reading it? What is it about, and how does it help our listeners?
Well, it starts with, I guess, a real basic unlearning, I like to call it. And I think of it in terms of a fishbowl and a fish. And we can put a fish in the fishbowl, in a round fishbowl, and we see the behavior of the fish is going around in circles. And what have we been doing for organizations for so many years? Well, we've been trying to change the behavior of the fish. And what I realized is, in fact, we really need to focus on, hey, let's change the bowl. And then we can begin to change the behavior of the fish. And I think that's Constructing Leadership 4.0 is saying a couple of things. It's saying, one, that we are, bear in mind this was written pre-COVID, that we are definitely going through a paradigm shift, because we are entering into what we call Industry 4.0, and that's all about the connected economy, the connected organization. It's about the agile organization. It's about the fact that generations now are changing. Generational attitude to work is changing, which is creating the need or the desire for flexibility. So there's a huge shift that's going on in the workplace. These shifts have gone on in the past, but this feels like a big one. And my war cry is that we must organizations need to prepare for this, and they need to think about three things: technology, mindset, and systems. And they're all correlated. And the role of leadership, the Leadership 4.0 piece, is to actually think in a whole system way of how organizations run.
What an amazing analogy. Your fish in a fishbowl. We keep trying to teach this fish kind of new tricks or new patterns, but the bowl remains the same. The system remains the same. And so what are some examples, if you have some, of experiences that you've had with organizations and systems that really have changed the fishbowl, or have you seen that happen yet?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is to get a tad theoretical, but not too much. I mean, this is organizations have been trying to do this for 50 years. That's the irony of. I mean, we started really post-war, around about the sort of 50s and 60s, but definitely by the 70s, when Japan entered the technological race and we were looking to achieve excellence. We have been looking and exploring how we develop the kind of the leadership model, and we've made a journey. I say the organizations have made a journey, and they've gone from sort of transactional leadership, which is, you know, the leader telling the follower or the employee what to do, to this kind of transformational leadership, which is a kind of a partnership of sort of an enablement of people in the workplace. But what I say in my book is that this doesn't work. Transformational leadership just hasn't lived up to the billing or the expectation. And so the reason for that is coming back to this core question around systems, because in transformational leadership, what you teach leaders to become transformational, and through their charisma and through their influence, they change the system, and you get this kind of learning organization effect, which is the Peter Senge whole idea coming into play, so that single leaders can make a difference and shape the system. But what happens is, and this is my experience of actually developing leaders, is that you take that leader on the journey, you take them out of the workplace. Sometimes we work with them in the workplace, but usually it's residential, it's out of the workplace. You can spend a week, 2 weeks, a month working with leaders to make them into transformational leaders. And what do? They go back into the system, and what happens is the conditional aspect of that system basically pushes them back to being the same old leaders. And and it also, conversely, it happens where the system, you know, so a leader will go into the system having been on a sort of transformational journey, and everybody's very cynical about this new leader. You know, what's happened? You know, where's the authenticity? What I've been trying to do, or working with leaders, is to think about how we transform the actual system itself, and technology is the enabler to that, with that and for that.
And I'm sure because of COVID, because of the global pandemic, we have seen an increase of technology in education and other organizations, for sure, their use especially, and the demand for it. And, you know, you mentioned there are key factors that affect this transformation in leadership and the effectiveness in a system. Can you give us some examples, or what are some of those factors that you feel, whether it be in education or the industry, what are some of those factors that truly affect how a system can evolve?
I don't think I understand your question, Brian. Sorry.
It's a bit of a loaded question, I think. You mentioned, you know, a system and taking leaders out of a system to train them to become transformational leaders, and then having them go back into the system and kind of revert back to their old ways. What are some of the factors that you feel need to be changed or will affect how we can not have that happen?
Yeah, so sorry, that's a great question. And that goes back to the way organizations are wired. And they are hardwired around conditioning, what Skinner calls operant conditioning. And that can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. I mean, it comes through the very sort of promotion ladder. That conditions behaviors. It comes through bonuses. It comes through the 9 to 5 presentism. It comes through the expectation that we have around leaders who go through the sort of the management, tend to go through the management step ladder to get to leadership. So they go through the whole organization and conditioning factor. So this is a huge fix, because if you want to start thinking about organizations in a different way, it's not just the sort of thing we did in the 1980s, which is kind of knock down a few walls and make the office a bit open planned, which can tend to annoy a lot of people as well. No, it's deeper than that. I mean, it's attitudinal and it's behavioral. It's saying, how can we create the right conditions here? How can we make, for example, how can we change job titles? How can we change the way we work? How can we change the whole contractual idea about working sort of in a set time frame? How can we change the culture, the organizational culture that celebrates and promotes technical excellence, but also intellectual excellence? And how can we redefine that to start thinking about the collective organization and how leadership can be far more collective, and how the mark of a good leader is not their technical or intelligent angle, but really how they can begin to create the right environment, which is the collaborative environment, an agile environment for people to succeed. And that's a big ask and a big shift.
Yeah, absolutely. But great words to say. It doesn't happen overnight. There's a mindset, there's a systems effect, there's a whole way of outlook for it to transform down the road. And we've talked a little bit about your book, the Constructing Leadership 4.0. And we've been talking a little bit prior to this. And is there a second book coming out? Is there another piece of literature on its way?
Well, yes. Well, there is, Brian. So I've just finished my new book. And it's called The Nature of Business Transformation, because the thing that I just finished, the final I, the dot, the sitting back in the chair, the feeling kind of rather happy with the world that you've written a book. And then I instantly started thinking to myself, well, in fact, how do you make it work? I did tackle this in the book. I did work this, and I got loads of tools. But in fact, there's the organizational change effort, the business transformation effort, and that's the thing I think that you're touching on, which I believe in, which is I think there needs to be a phased approach, a accelerated approach. John Kotter's has a recent book out called Acceleration, and he looks at a phased approach of transforming the business. And my new book explores really a three-phased approach of how we can set about getting to the point of being a more collective organization, collective decision-making, collective leadership. And it is all about changing the structure. It is about changing mindsets and behaviors, but it's also, in my new book, very much about taking on the emergent technology and allowing that to facilitate this new behavioral collective change.
I'm equally as excited to read that book now. Like, I think the words you write are amazing and inspirational to the point of wanting to kind of make you think. And you mentioned, I'll go back to your first analogy of the fish in the fishbowl. It kind of makes us as leaders, as individuals, look at the world differently rather than just say, okay, how do I change this overnight? But really, how do I affect change across the whole system? And let's talk a little bit about the Atlantic Education. Oh, actually, when can people expect this book to come out?
Okay, so it's now with the publisher, and it's going through the editing phase. So I would say possibly about 2 to 3 months.
Okay, wonderful.
It should be, and it'll be published by Routledge.
That's great. That's great to hear. So we can expect it on the shelves in 2 to 3 months. That's awesome. And so let's divert a little bit to the Atlantic Education Institute and your keynote, because it's so amazing to have you as the opening keynote for this year's Atlantic Education Institute. What can our participants and our listeners and our viewers expect to hear during your keynote address?
Okay, so I won't show all my cards, but you see, I think the challenge is, when the interesting thing is when you start looking at everything from a systems point of view, you sort of go beyond the boundaries. So the organizational challenges that I've been exploring for 30 years are also, I note, educational challenges, or school education challenges. They're the same challenges because it's the same phenomenon that's happened. And very briefly, it's, I think, the last 100 years definitely, but it's longer than that. There has been a shift, and that shift, as we know, has been around from being sort of a centralized culture, and that's right the way through to a constructed culture, and then onto what I'm calling a connected culture. So these are the sort of three. There are other phases, but these are three phases I see, and this runs through all the systems. So, for example, in organizations, the centralization was very dominant in the earliest 20th century. The classic management, there's a school of classic management theorists, and they actually supported and championed the idea of centralization, from, bureaucracy and standardization. And we can see that has its legacy to almost the Industrial Revolution and beyond. I mean, that sort of scent of the centralized force. Centralization was in education as well. I mean, the idea of rows of chairs and the central dominant teacher at the front. I'm thinking particularly of the author I love is Charles Dickens and Hard Times, and there's a beautiful description of a Victorian school where the teacher is on the raised platform, the kids are in the rows of chairs, and it's all about the locus of authority is with the teacher. That's also in organizations. We've had leaders being very dominant. We've come out of what's called the great man theory of Thomas Carlyle, which was, and it's from Nietzsche as well, championing this idea of the exceptionalism and the charismatic person. Well, interestingly, about the mid-century, 20th century and a little bit beyond, we got into this theory of constructivism. And this ties into my PhD thesis, so that's why it's something I'm quite interested in. But that constructivism is about constructed reality. So it's about a partnership between leader and employee, teacher and student. And constructivism has been with us for a long time. But the thing about constructivism is you still have a centralized figure in constructivism. You have someone who's creating the chances, creating the structure for others to succeed. In educational speak, that's known as scaffolding from the theorists such as Vygotsky and Brunner, who talk about the role of the educator is to create the scaffold for the student to learn from. Well, in business, we also had this. We had, and it was called transformational leadership. We had the idea of the leader creating a fellowship, constructing the chances, but still, in fact, being a leader in a traditional sense. So now I'm moving on to my third phase, which I think is the future, and that's around the connectivism and connections. Because again, if we start with education, what you've got students who are second generation, second digital native generation. They're very fluent and very comfortable with augmented intelligence of going into their pockets, coming out with their Google and connecting on the social media. They're practically cyborgs. Elon Musk calls them actually cyborgs, the cyborg generation. And yet, the educational system can still reflect quite a traditional classroom approach. So, and that's the same in business. What we have in business is we have traditional leaders, but we also have the idea of this new generation of workers, the millennials, who have different expectations and are more about connectivity than they are about construction. So I mean, that's a snapshot of saying that there is a massive seismic shift going on, I believe, toward away from constructivism, which has dominated our systems for so long, toward connectivism. And that's all about people giving up control, and it's also about people connecting and learning through their relationships and through their collaborations.
Wow. Like I think, and just listening to you speak, it's so great to hear in that flow of this journey that we've been on into this connectivism kind of generation. I'm excited for this keynote, and hopefully our listeners and our viewers join us, to listen to Dr. Kelly speak about it and this, and what it looks like and what it feels like in this reality. And I think many people can learn from it, and our leaders can see even maybe some future, what the steps moving forward might be for themselves in listening to you speak. And so, Dr. Kelly, I have one final question for you here today. And we know the theme of the Atlantic Education Institute is around innovative leadership. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think it means to be an innovative leader?
That's a great question. And so I think this connects a little bit back to the theme I was talking about as well. So innovation is about new. It's from the Latin to create anew. And we have, for so long, we've had authority figures, teachers, leaders, who have attempted to steer that new perspective, that innovative approach. And for me, the revolution or the thinking is about actually how do you galvanize the system? How do you get collective decision making, a collective innovation? So the role of the leader or the teacher in that sense changes. It ceases to become the scaffold I was talking about, the constructor of the experience or knowledge, and actually becomes someone who is enabling, connecting, facilitating to some degree the collective knowledge that's in the system. And for me, that's where future leadership and innovation is going to lie. It's about collective intelligence. And if I can just finally plug, I link this in both my books to superorganisms and particularly honeybees. I'm fascinated by honeybees. And I use the idea of superorganisms such as ants, honeybees throughout my book. And what is remarkable about honeybees, and I explore this very much in my new book, is that they have been able to have a form of leadership that we can only dream about. Can you imagine, for example, that every single year, 2/3 of the colony leave the mother nest and go collectively, over 10,000 bees collectively decide, and there's the ways they do that are interesting, but I won't go into it now, collectively decide where they are going to set up a new colony, and then they set up that new colony. And if organizations, how many years does it take for organizations to do a simple redevelopment? So I think the innovative space here is we should learn from the natural systems, and we should use enabling technology to be able to facilitate it. And that's
absolutely amazing. And I love the honeybee example. I want you to go into the ants example. Now I just want to talk for a couple hours because it's even more interesting. But as we know, we'll have to hold off to your keynote at the Atlantic Education Institute. And so, Dr. Kelly, I thank you so much for taking the time and joining me on the podcast, sharing your story, sharing some information about your books, and a little bit about what your keynote's going to look like at the Atlantic Education Institute as well. So for all of our listeners out there, I encourage you, check out Dr. Kelly's book, Constructing Leadership 4.0. And don't forget, you can sign up and join us at the Atlantic Education Institute from July 26th to August 6th. Just go to the website, connected-community.ca, also in the show notes for you as well. Don't forget, as always, let's make learning creative, and follow us on social media using @MyCreativePod. My name is Brian Willett, and this was My Creative Classroom.